Right now, with the latest alarm over this recent report dealing with climate change being enough to change the political climate on the subject. And if you think climate's only a worry for people along the shore, you better think again. We've got an eye-opening interview with one of the UN's report's authors. And then, the nation's only county-owned amusement park in the news and causing headaches yet again. So, what should Westchester do when it comes to PLAYLAND? And then, if we didn't have enough money in politics, here comes the Supreme Court to the rescue. Not so much. A new decision could turn that river of political cash into a tidal wave. Our legal experts are going to break down today's controversial ruling. Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thanks so much for joining us this Wednesday evening, April 2nd. Now think about the environment today and what it could possibly hold for your kids, let alone grandkids. A Nobel Prize winning group of 300 scientists say, and trust me, if anybody debates about unanimity in the science community, please just stop already. Everybody agrees with this. They say we ought to not just be worried, very worried. The report released this week by the UN says the worst, it's yet to come. And climate change will cause more intense heat waves, heavier rains, major natural disasters. They say humanitarian crisis, it's not possible, it's inevitable. And severe weather conditions will cause mass human migration. Food like fish, rice, wheat, corn, they're going to grow scarcer, and obviously the price of foods here, if not even doubling in the next 30 years. Researchers say there will be more political instability and, yes, more violence. They also say this is not going to be just a problem in the distant future. We're experiencing the problems right now. Princeton University Professor Dr. Michael Oppenheimer, he's a lead author on this report, and I spoke with him via Skype earlier today. You know, Professor, the report clearly lays out a few just definites, including climate change. It's already happening across the world, and that we are clearly not ready for the risks, which only get a lot scarier on a rapidly warming planet. Do I have it right?
Yes, what's new in this report is that as opposed to previous reports where it was clear that the climate was changing, now we have some indication that it's affecting human beings in significant ways already, and I'll point to two of those. Number one, crop yields, which globally had been growing for decades at rates of 10 or 15%, have stabilized now, and they appear not to be growing much, if at all. And that's because climate change appears to be affecting crop yields by pushing them downward rather than upward, which is bad news, of course, because the population of the world is growing, because food habits are changing, people are eating further up the food chain. There could be a gap between demand and supply, and that when that happens, some people don't have enough to eat, and that means malnutrition at least, and perhaps starvation. The other interesting new impact that's been noted is that there are more people are dying in heat waves due to the climate change than are that are better off because of winters being warmer. And that's bad news for the same reason. We have a lot of trouble dealing with heat-related deaths, and it's plagued not just the poor countries, but the rich countries for a long time.
Now, is it possible to know where, who, and what will be most immediately impacted by continuing climate change?
In that regard, there are three headlines to the report, in my view. Food, which I just mentioned, and I would look first to the low-latitude developing, in particular the least developed countries, places like sub-Saharan Africa, which have lots of problems. This is just an added headache they don't need. The second area I'd point to would be cities all around the world, because cities, wondrous as they are places where risk is compounded. For instance, you get not only the heat from global warming, but you get the urban heat island effect, which traps heat, particularly at night, around cities and makes them warmer than the surrounding countryside. And then on top of that, you frequently get high levels of air pollution, and the combination of air pollution and heat is deadly. In addition, because a lot of there's infrastructures underground are very vulnerable to flooding, and we haven't done a very good job of protecting the underneath part of cities, which are, of course, critical to the survival of the city as a whole. And The third area I'd point to is any place along the coast, because sea level is rising. It rose 8 inches in the previous century. It's now rising at a rate which is about 1.5 to 2 times that rate, and sea level rise is expected to just keep accelerating through this century and beyond.
If you can maybe expand on this a little bit, I think it's really important our audience gets here that nobody gets a free pass here. Everybody will be impacted by climate change, right?
Well, in some way, everybody's already being affected by climate change. The climate of the whole world is different. In the future, as the climate warms, if it warms as expected, we'll tend to see more heat waves in certain places like the southwest of the United States, probably more drying, which will make it interfere with water supplies, which are already a limiting factor on growth in certain areas there. Ecosystems, which are globally important, like coral reefs or the Arctic ice system, are going to be disintegrating, and a lot of livelihoods depend on those systems. For instance, the tourism and fishing communities that live off coral reefs, that survive off coral reefs. So if you put that picture together, on the whole, global warming, which might have been a small benefit to the economy in some places, with modest warming, when you get to around 3 or 4 degrees of Fahrenheit warming, you get to a point where it's just a drag on the whole global economy.
The report goes into detail about some of the consequences that will happen if we don't change things here. But 2 of those consequences particularly caught my attention. That is mass population displacement and increased conflict. That all, obviously, as water and food get scarcer. People get more desperate, right, when those things happen.
2 things that are starting to emerge in the scientific literature are that people migrate when the climate is unfavorable. So the projections that exist, which are preliminary, suggest that across some areas and some borders, migration will be on the increase due to climate change. And the second observation is that there's a long-term association between increased conflict and many of the conditions that we know feed conflict, like resource limitations, not enough water, not enough food, are things that could be exacerbated by warming. So although it's a new area of research, it does seem to be indicating that conflicts will be intensified by the kinds of limitations on society that global warming will impose.
Finally, how does this report, the consensus of the scientific community and the limited time that we actually have to do something about it, how does that resonate not just with world leaders here, but maybe more importantly, the general public, to make those leaders do something about it? Is it essential that basically we have to scare the public into action?
This report is not designed to be scary. The language is very moderate. For instance, I've used the words malnutrition and starvation, which I don't think the report actually uses. The report uses the more anodyne term, food security. So that's certainly not the intention. The intention was to put the facts out there in a form that policymakers can understand, that is, make it readable, make it not just numbers or some technically dry presentation. But on the other hand, it doesn't help to scare people, because you scare people, you'll demobilize them, and they just don't know what to do about a problem. What I'd hope is that more knowledge stimulates people to action. Knowledge should be informative and energizing. It's not supposed to be scary and paralyzing.
Professor Oppenheimer, thank you so much. I appreciate the time.
I'm glad to have joined you today.